from Chicago, it's Art with Anderson, the show that talks, teaches, and tackles all things art. Here's your host, Joe Anderson.
All right, hey, it's Mr. A back at you with another art video today for our draw along. Welcome to spring. We're going to do some springtime sketching. And I went on a walk the other day and was admiring all the early blooming flowers. And if you're anything like me, stuck inside during this quarantine, it's been a little tough to stay motivated. But taking those walks, as long as you're keeping social distance, has been kind of a relief and a way for me to reset, especially as an artist. So you want to just keep in mind, as an artist, you're living a life of the mind. You're trying to stay sensitive. You're trying to keep your eyes open to beauty, just even if it's in your own backyard. So today I thought we'd just kind of celebrate the arrival of spring, and there's no way to do that in Chicago like snow. We woke up to snow this morning. A couple inches, surprisingly, which is this does feel like a little bit of a setback, but we're not going to get discouraged. So today, the photo you're looking at, I guess over here on this side, is a few daffodils I picked in the local forest preserve here. And again, if you're going to be picking anyone's flowers, make sure you get permission to do so. But, I set up a little bit of a photo set with some lighting, and that's always kind of the fun part. But you can certainly draw if you have some fresh flowers that you pick, set up a nice vase. But for our studio purposes, I set it up as a picture, and I'll have that up on the screen as we start. Now, the other thing, I have some supplies here, and I'm going to kind of transition between our screens. And you'll see my setup here. It's a little unconventional because of my setup here, but I wanted to make sure you guys see everything I'm doing. I'm actually drawing on some actual watercolor paper. It's kind of expensive. It's this Arches stuff, and this has kind of a rougher grain to it. And the best part about watercolor paper is that it's built to withstand some of the water. So if you're at home and drawing on watercolor paper, or on computer paper or something like that, you might get some buckling where the paper kind of gets wrinkly. You might also get a little bit of tearing if you get it too wet. So don't be too frustrated if you're drawing on something like computer paper or even notebook paper. Those things are not really designed to capture all the water that goes into the paper. But it's still kind of a fun thing, especially if you work quickly and confidently, and that's what watercolor is all about. Is embrace the chaos. We're just going to create an impression of these flowers. We're not trying to do photorealistic. Remember, cameras exist to make photorealistic stuff. Watercolor is all about capturing the energy, the light, and not getting too ahead of ourselves and trying to get too obsessive. I also have this kind of standard setup of my watercolors. These are kind of pan colors. You may have something that's a little bit more elementary, kind of those oval, whether it's like Crayola or Rose Art or something like that. Surprisingly, you can have a lot of fun with those, and we'll talk about a little bit of like color mixing. But I'll give you some tips to avoid too much mixing, because it can be kind of frustrating if you add too many colors early on. So the other thing I have are some watercolor brushes. Any brushes will do, but what I want to point out is I have a couple different shapes here. Sometimes like these flat brushes can come in handy if you want like a nice clean edge. A couple different sizes of those. And then I recently got these awesome Sable Kolinsky brushes. They're ridiculously expensive, but if you decide that you love watercolor, investing in good materials makes it all the more enjoyable and successful. So, but don't worry about that. The only other thing you'll see me probably use, just because it's kind of annoying to dip in water sometimes, this is an actual brush pen. So it's got a paintbrush on the end. Okay, and this, you can fill it up with ink, but I have it filled up with water right now. We'll use that for a few cool moves. But like I said, if this is your first time or you're not prepared to follow along, no worries. But we will be sketching to start off. And let's do that. So I have a standard 2B pencil. I think this is, 2HB. And I'm just going to start off by looking at the photo. And remember, the photo's already there. That's not going to change. Our decision as an artist is really just to kind of just take ownership of this image and we might make some changes. So you can see that my paper is a little bit different shape, but what I'm going to do is kind of mark off little areas where I want to put my flowers in advance. So the top flower, I'm just going to kind of say the height might be up there. And then the left flower, I want to say that it's not going to go any farther than this. I don't want it to run off the page too far. And then, so what I like to do is kind of imagine these angles. Like here's where the top of the flower is. It's almost like a dot to dot if you've ever done one of those. Get an angle. Maybe it gets a little taller. And the reason I'm just doing little dots is because I don't want to get too crazy, especially if you're using nice paper. A lot of times I'll draw it out on a separate sheet and then trace it on there. But if I want to keep this moving, watercolor should be done quickly, in my opinion. Again, it's just my opinion. I'm just kind of sketching out some of those details very lightly. You can erase on this paper, but we want to keep these things light. And let's find where that other flower is. I'm doing very general shapes. I apologize if this is a little light. I'm looking, this is almost like a pentagon or something. I'm just looking for basic geometric shapes. Okay, so we have a stem here. Let's try to sketch that in. Stem kind of goes up. This really does get a little taller than I was planning. Well, that's okay. Got to use up this nice paper, I guess. So what I love about daffodils is they have this cool like cup-like shape in the middle. And there's these really wavy details in there. And this is rough paper, so I'm sorry if you can't see the pencil as well. Again, this is what we call blocking in. These lines can change. I've used the metaphor before of, you know, these are construction lines, just like scaffolding is on a building. You don't leave the scaffolding on when you finish the building project. I'm trying to get the general shapes. I'm not worried about shading right now. I'm not even thinking about color really. But I like just getting the locations, and remember, like if you were a professional artist, no one's really going to see this photo, right? So they won't know what to compare it to, so don't worry about that. What I love about these daffodils too is they have this kind of like bulb-like shape right underneath the flower. Here's my stem. And I notice there's this beautiful shape in between this daffodils right underneath. So I'm just trying to catch those basic structures. You know, some artists might do a more direct approach where they would actually just start painting with watercolor. I would not recommend it if you're a beginner. It's certainly a great experience, but let's just say it's a major challenge, especially if you get frustrated easily on unpredictable things. You have to be very good, almost a master at accepting happy accidents. Notice these things really don't look like flowers. I'm just getting the general shape. Now what's interesting about this white flower down here is it's at a different angle, and we can kind of see that central area opening up. I am going to loosely put in an oval to show that center of that flower. It's certainly not straight. It has kind of like these wobbles in there. Maybe we can zoom into that picture a little later. But I can put in a little bit more of the shape of the flower petals. But that earlier geometric shape helped me locate the tips of each one of those things. Remember, those flowers are really soft and supple, kind of like sheer too. So we'll talk a little bit about why watercolors are beautiful for painting things like flowers, very delicate stuff. And while I'm sketching these things out, let's talk about watercolor. So with colored pencils or even just regular pencils, if I want to control how light or dark something is, I usually control that by how hard I'm pressing. You know, obviously I can pick a darker color and blend that together. But when it comes to watercolor, you're actually controlling how much pigment or paint you have on your brush versus how much water is in the brush and on the paper. So we'll talk about that because there's two different primary ideas with watercolor painting. There's wet into dry. What that means is your brush is wet with paint, but the paper is dry. And then you have wet into wet. So what that means is the paper is wet, and there's some really interesting effects that can happen in that case. So as you notice, this is not the proportion that's like super accurate, but for our purposes, kind of liking it. Look at your pictures, your like photographs that you use as more of an inspiration and less of something to compare yourself to. It would be very sad if you turned into a camera, right? You'd lose all those beautiful human features that are unique, which, you know, obviously enables you to see beauty. Cameras are dumb instruments. I'm not trashing photographers, but anyway, photographers have their own sets of skills and ways to express themselves. We won't talk trash. Anyway, so one key thing, if you're watching me do those sea animals earlier, maybe it was like last week, we talked about overlap. For something like this where there's several flowers, creating a sense of overlap is going to help us create depth. So it's not just a flat, like pressed flower. So the stems kind of go behind the flowers. You could even put a few in front. But what I love about the leaves of the daffodil is they kind of twist. So notice over here, I really like overlapped that shape. It almost looks like a ribbon. They get these really cool twisty feely things. And that can give it a lot of character. And another way to think of this is we're making a coloring book for ourselves. It's going to be a little bit more advanced than a typical one. But the problem with coloring books, especially for artists, is that they usually have really dark outlines. Now, our goal with a watercolor painting is typically to almost erase all evidence that this was a drawn picture, right? We don't want to see much of the pencil in there. So we're not trying to overload this, but if you do start on here, again, if you have a tracing box, it's a great way to do your line drawing first, and then you can certainly trace it onto your nice piece of paper, or even if it's a junky piece of paper, you'll be surprised with, you know, if you don't have to erase a bunch of stuff. And where there's details that are cut off, I mean, I'm not being super paranoid if I don't get the right proportions off the bat. We know there's going to be some happy accidents in here, so best prepare for that by just not putting too much pressure from the beginning. All right. So I hope this is going to be a general shape that I can start preparing kind of a strategy. So watercolor is all about being confident. And even if you're not confident in drawing accurately or making it look accurate, I want you to just pretend to be, like, I guess a better word would be decisive. Pick a color, stick with it, and apply it, and make a decision beforehand. Leaving some things to chance. Let's just say there's already enough chaos when you do watercolor painting. You shouldn't be the source of it. Like, you want to make your decisions ahead of time and plan it out. The reason why is because in traditional watercolor, there's no white paint. And the reason for that is the paper is white. So instead of mixing a color with white paint, we're going to be protecting the lightest areas of the painting. So going into this, before I lay anything down, I'm looking at my lightest spots. That's going to be this white flower here. and even this light yellow interior. I'm going to also put like this little dark area here. That's kind of the base of it, of that little funnel. This white flower, and then the yellows, think of them almost like white. We want to have like pretty pure yellows up in here at the end. But then we can kind of flip to the reverse. What are the darkest areas we can start with? Certainly down here underneath, getting the shape of that bulb shape underneath the stems and all these leaves. We want to just start with some of those darker areas first in order to get just like a really nice base color to help this thing start popping out. I'm going to show you guys the difference between wet into wet or wet into dry, because it's kind of an exciting differentiation, but I'm just going to take a minute to get set up here because I do want to have another close-up of some of this painting thing, and we'll zoom into our picture here. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so I'm going to make this larger for you to see. You might not be able to see my paint set, but I do want to just have this as an opportunity to look a little bit closer at what we have. Again, my proportions are close enough. We're trying to just make a painting, not a photograph. And we're going to just pick a brush that kind of has the same shape that we want to paint on there. Now, the nice thing about plants is they very rarely have these sharp edges to them. So I'm actually going to start off with something like this. This is a round brush, but if we dip it in water, it gets nice and sharp. And that's really fun. The other one you could use, and I love this word, it's called a filbert. It's like a flat, but it's round at the front. So let's grab those two brushes to start. Another thing that you want to get in the habit of is really make sure your brushes are clean. So I'm kind of reaching off camera here to make sure those are clean. And maybe I'll scoot this thing over so you can see a little bit of my mixing going on. So you can kind of see that side. All right. So here are my colors here. And we're going to start off with these greens. First off, on these leaves, try to think of your greens or blues or any type of color. Are they warm? Or are they cool? And so warm colors, like I think that the front part of those leaves are definitely like a little bit warmer. And so I have a couple of these over here. I don't want to overpower them just yet. I'm going to dip this brush in water, and I'm going to bring a little bit of this green out onto the palette. It's a pretty neon green. And I got to kind of wet this little cake here. It's really intense, but for the first coat, we want to kind of just get some really great color in there. Let's compare it to, maybe I'll just dip a little bit in here, see how that changes it. That's definitely a little bit warmer, but it's definitely really intense compared to our picture over here. So how do we tone that down? Well, one way is you could add an opposite. I'm going to actually add kind of like a dirty yellow, which is kind of this, what do you call this? Why can't I think of the name? It's not Naples yellow. Oh, yellow ochre, right? So that kind of tones it down. That looks a little bit closer to what we're doing. And for our purposes, the key thing is to remember that mix. We had a little bit of this. We had a little bit of yellow. But we didn't add any black to make it darker. That's the key. You never really want to add black in a watercolor painting unless you're really confident. I always say it's like the salt and pepper of painting. Is like you really only want to use it at the end just to season it. So let's try laying this down. Now, remember, my brush is wet right now, and we're going on to dry paper. So let's see how that looks. So I'm just kind of coloring in. And with this beautiful rough paper, kind of adds a little bit of a texture effect. And I'm painting it trying to keep it in the lines. The one other thing about painting with watercolor is the more coats you put on it, the more color goes on the paper. So trying to be confident and just put that stuff into the painting, fill it in as quick as possible, as accurate as possible. Let's try it again. Notice that you get those kind of crinkly effects if you have rough paper. You really got to do a coat or two to get that into those little bumps so it doesn't look as gravelly. You can certainly use that to your advantage in other parts of the painting. So this is another thing, is keep in mind you might have to mix up some more of that color. Try to keep it similar. A lot of times I'll have a test sheet of paper to make sure I can compare it before I put it onto my paper. Because just by adding more water, you're going to dilute it out. You also don't want to have too much water on the brush. So see how that one looked a little bit lighter? So when we add a really thinned out type of color, that's called a wash. So we're putting a nice little wash on there. But the other thing is if you want really precise lines, you want it to be dry before you add another coat or change it up. And sometimes this kind of change in the color is what we want. I kind of like that. So again, I'm going to do this one. You don't want all of your leaves to look exactly the same, right? All right, but we can definitely tell that these are a little bit more on the lighter side. Don't worry about that. We don't want to get too dark too quick. I'm going to grab some more of this green and mix up another batch. Because we really didn't make it dark. We just kind of changed the temperature of that color. Hold on, I'm going to scoot over our photo a little bit. Make it a little bit smaller. All right. By the way, quick shout out. It looks like Joe, Kate, Rick, and Sue are all in class today. Thank you for joining. Good to have you. All right. Now, the one thing I will say about watercolor painting is your materials make a big difference. For example, the colors that you use. If you buy cheap watercolors, they typically don't have as much pigment or the chemical that makes it that color, so they're not as vibrant. So if you're looking to get those, it might be worth the investment in more, they might be a little bit more expensive, but they certainly will pay off. They'll be more satisfying. You might not give up as soon. All right, so I'm going to actually do all the stems with this base color we have. Sometimes you need a little bit more water to make that paint flow. And just be confident. This is kind of just our base color, but it helps us establish what's going on in the picture. Maybe you want to leave a little bit of that dry brush technique in there. It's not fully resolved. So see how those like speckles of white. And we'll bring it up into the stem here. But if you're not sure if you want to put something in one place or another, you can kind of back off. Fill this in with a base coat. Now, what I mentioned before is limiting how much color or how many colors you choose to get started with is a great way to keep your stress level down, which is big when you're painting in watercolor. Okay? So you don't want to get carried away and try to mix all your own colors. Try to just mess with it a little bit so you can just stick with a few set mixes. All right, so what do you say we start working on some of these leaves? These are way lighter than they are in the picture. So what colors can I do to start putting a darker coat in? Now the thing is getting to know your paper. This is pretty much already dry because I started with dry paper, okay? But it might be a little wet. It's not too bad. But what I'm going to do we're going to try a wet into wet on the flowers, but we'll kind of stick with this dry technique here. I'm going to look for a darker green. Okay, that's certainly darker, but it's just so saturated. The chroma level is high, which means it's very like electric. It's got a lot of juice in that color. That's definitely not in our picture there. So I'm actually going to take what seems odd. I'm going to take some red. I'm going to mix it there and tone it down. It certainly doesn't look red, but this is the color that we're going to use to darken up some of those areas. And we'll just try that out. So I'm going for those areas that are like kind of in the folds. So I'm going to try it along the edge. You see how it gets a little bit darker towards the edge here? It almost looks like I'm drawing, right? So having a nice brush for doing that nice line, it's a good way to go. But it does look a little bit intense, and we'll talk about some ways to get that going again. But let's put that edge in there. Now what's cool is I can take some water on my brush and I can start to work this edge and maybe even pull some of this darker color out. I'm just going to put some water here and I can rework some of that color in there to soften it up so it doesn't look so harsh. So that's kind of reactivating your colors. That can be a really awesome thing if you want to do it, or a really annoying thing if you had no intention. But that's what's neat about watercolors, is that they're never really, I mean, they could be dry, but they can certainly be reactivated. So really what I'm doing here is putting another wash of this color over the top of this so it's not as dark. Or I'm sorry, it's more dark, right? Let me try it here. It doesn't have to be as intense. So I'm only on one side to kind of show the curve of that shape. Especially with dark colors, we don't want to go too fast. We can always come back and add more. So if you notice that it's like too wet to do anything about, maybe it's time to move on to the next one. So this is a technique called glazing. You can do it with watercolor, you can do it with oil paint. This is great for darkening up some areas if the first application wasn't dark enough. Or you can do some shading to make things appear more 3D. It's great for showing maybe the twist of those leaves. You know, one side is showing the shadow. The other side is in the light. So we have a little bit more variety in these leaves now. It's not the craziest thing just yet. We haven't done anything too much. So let's kind of switch gears. Let's talk about these flowers. Okay, we're going to try a wet into wet technique. Now we'll start with this yellow flower up here, the daffodil, and I want to make sure that I have a clean brush for this. because what we're going to do is pre-wet the paper. And what I love about this technique, I'm just going to paint clear water on there just for that whole shape that's going to be yellow. Now, if you have good watercolor paper, that shape that you paint in as water, think of it like a container. Whatever shape you put it into, the paint is going to flow into that area, and it won't go outside of it. All right. So I've got that nice and wet, but imagine it like a painting. But what I'm going to do now, keep that brush kind of clean. I'm going to get another brush just to get some color into there. And I'm going to mix up some yellow. And while it's still wet, I want to make sure that this is a clean yellow. Sometimes you have some stuff kind of left over from your last dab. You want to make sure you can kind of clean off those little cakes so they stay pure. Now this yellow looks a little bit too lemony for right now. This one's definitely more of a warm one, so I'm going to try this yellow. Clean that off a little bit. All right, so we have that really nice yellow here. Now let's see what happens when it's kind of a wet mix of yellow. On camera it looks a little bit greener than it does for me, but watch this. We're going to just pick some of those darker areas. I'm just dabbing that color in. We're going to watch it spread. Especially since I have my stuff on a slant here. I'm just dabbing it into those areas that have water already, and it literally magically fills in the shape that I painted with water. So wet and wet is awesome for getting these very cool transitions. We're going to try some wet and wet mixing. So all this yellow area is nice and wet. You can kind of adjust it. Now if I add water, it's going to kind of wash this stuff out. It might drip. So I don't want to get too crazy with it just yet, but I can start adding some more colors in there. So like what if I take this kind of, here's a red over here. I'm going to take more of this sandy red like this. And instead of drawing like a dark shadow with black, what I'm going to do is just lightly touch in the area. This is going to be the area that's kind of in shadow. Using the corner of that brush just to kind of push some shapes around, but that wet paper is going to do some of the work for me. It's almost going to blend it in these soft little changes. So you're taking advantage of nature here. The principle that this water kind of feeds into the fibers of the paper. And you're taking advantage of that. So along the edge you might want to shade it, and then it nice and like kind of floats into that other area. Doesn't look like little brush strokes. See how much this expanded and spread out? That's what we're going to take advantage of today. So now that that area is still wet, the problem is you can't control it as much. So if you have something very precise to do, it is a little bit tougher. But let's say I want to take some of this green, which was my shadow. I don't know if this is going to work very well. It's just a little bit. I want to put some right here, darken that up on this side of the flower. Maybe on this flower petal over here, it's a little bit darker. So instead of using black or something, we're using green, another color that I already had mixed. These beautiful organic transitions are what you want to take advantage of. Maybe there's a whole other one here down on this side. I'm going to put some into the flower bulb there. So you can see how that takes care of something for us. It almost creates fences around. So the water actually has a really good edge to it. That's really fun, as long as you're prepared for it. But if the whole sheet of paper was wet, you'd have things bleeding everywhere. So that's a wet into wet technique that you can take advantage of, where the paper will do a lot. Paper and the water will do a lot of the work for you. All right, so let's go back to that yellow again. Let's put some water in. The other thing you should do is keep in mind that your water, if you're using the same water to clean your brushes, that's going to get dirty at some point. So you want to make sure that you use a fresh thing of paper if you need this stuff. So I'm going to use this water brush that has the water in there already. So I can just paint it on. I'm filling in that shape. Don't be afraid to be creative with some of these things. If you don't want it to show up somewhere, if you didn't want that yellow in an area, you wanted a pure white, you could certainly leave it dry. So water is your best friend in watercolor, but it's also can be your worst nightmare if you don't control it. Now this paper here is actually made out of cotton, so it's designed, like if you ever wore a pair of jeans and you got wet at the water park or in a rainstorm, it takes so long to dry out. This is a cotton piece of paper. It's designed to hold moisture for a long time. So let's make this thing yellow again. And I'm going to grab some more of that yellow paint. Notice I didn't really go to town all the way. Well, for these, they're pretty bright yellow. If your paper is slanted, watch that stuff kind of cascade down. Gravity is doing its work here. Kind of blends in. Sometimes you can take advantage of that to have really unique transitions of color. And by dabbing the color back in, you can control where that color goes. I'm going to keep this one pure yellow for right now. We could go do some of the other stuff, but let's kind of think about these areas here, because doing that wet and wet technique, this is more of a white flower with this interior in here, but we have to decide what we're going to use to do those shadows on the edges of those flower petals. And that's going to be a little bit tough decision, but once we make it, we'll commit. All right, we'll let that kind of dry, but I am going to use my water brush to start filling in this white flower. You could almost do each petal at the same time, but I'm not going to get the center part wet right now. This is just going to be the petals. We're just going to go the flower petals. Okay. So we wet that up. Now I'm going to take a smaller brush. And for this one, I don't want to use black necessarily. I'm almost thinking about like a blue for the shadows in this thing. But we want it to be relatively cool. So I'm going to just try to mix up a color here. here's going to be a blue. So I think this is called ultramarine blue. I'm not going to need a lot because this is a really subtle shape. But what we're going to do is just lightly draw along the edge where we see a slight shadow. So it almost just like folds around. And the water is going to blend it nice and soft for us. Here's little edges. You'll be surprised how much it makes it look 3D. Trying to avoid using black. Let the white of the paper do its job. Let it speak to you. But if I start small with very diluted paints, I can really get away with a lot. You can layer the things up very quickly and create delicate pieces like these flowers. So I'm trying to show some overlap. So underneath that one, I'm definitely kind of creating a little bit more of a transition. A little shadow under here. And notice how I kind of kept this area separate than that center part that's going to have a lot of yellow. I don't want to do too much with this blue there. But the way to think of water is like, is it still alive in your mix? Like if it's still wet, it's going to pull the paint for you. If it's dried out, it's kind of dead. And you just need to get good at measuring how alive your water is because it can certainly sneak up on you if you're not prepared. All right. Now on this flower, it's a little bit different. Let me move the picture over a little bit so you can see. All right, so we have that yellow center, but what I'm going to do is actually cheat a little bit because I noticed that most of the flowers, since it's facing the opposite direction, I should point this way, are in shadow. So I'm going to keep my blue mix really washed out, and I'm just going to go in there and paint some of those flower petals in. Sometimes you don't have to fill stuff in. You know, you can leave the white of the paper. So for sharper appearing strokes, you know, I'm just putting those in. What I love about watercolor is it's kind of like jazz music. It's about improv, about kind of making decisions on the fly. All right, so we have some nice cooler shadows in here. And let's go back to our first flower up here and start adding some detail that we might be able to do now that it's a little bit more dry. All right, so let's go back up here, and up near this edge we have those like really sharp shadows there, and I'm gonna be using that kind of sandy red, kind of like a sienna. It's almost close to a brown. I don't know if you can see that in the glare. And I'm going to put a tiny bit of its opposite, which would be green, in there, just to neutralize that, make it a little bit more brown. Now this is the point where having a nice sharp brush is going to be nice. So I'm using that nice sharp tip. And so I'm going to just kind of sketch in some of those areas and create a hard edge to mimic that shape of the shadow underneath that. Notice that it kind of sweeps down. Now you might not see any red in the actual photo, but that's okay. An artist has his own tools, his or her tools. You just need to use them with our best judgment. I'm going to put one shadow over here to make it look like that kind of trumpet looking spout thing is really popping up. Bring down this shadow a little bit. Remember, you're drawing that kind of ruffled edge of the flower. It should be nice and textured. But it is a pretty clear and distinct shape. But notice how the shadow kind of gets a little bit more faded here. It's not as intense. Well, if I dip I still have the paint on there. If I dip it in water, I'm diluting it out. And kind of create some water and use the water wet and wet to divert it a little bit. So I'm pulling that paint out to soften the edge a little bit. So this is why watercolor it's almost a mix between like classical painting of like acrylic or oil and drawing. You have to be able to draw and use the right tool. You have to kind of pick the right color, make sure that there's the right amount of water on your brush and on the paper. But that's what you learn to love about this medium. So there's an infinite amount of lessons to learn. So I want to capture this little thing kind of coming down and turning into this second petal, right? And this one here. So I want to show a little bit more shadow, the underside of the petal here. And in back, there's another piece in there somewhere. How about over here? Can we show little variations on the far side there to show that ruffled texture? But see how this kind of stayed that really bright yellow, intense yellow? You could darken this up as much as you want. Do another color wash. Let's do a few more on this one to really make this thing pop. This is where I kind of think about the shapes and how they relate to the shadows. And don't kid yourself, flowers are complex shapes. All right. So see how the underside of the flower has a slightly darker shape? But as I'm working, there's less paint on the brush, so it gets a little bit more diluted. So compare that with what I had up there. That's pretty intense. So as you work, you can kind of dilute out, control how much water you put in there. I'm going to put some more of those drawn shapes in. So I have this dark shadow, kind of swoops into that trumpet looking form. And I'm going to create that wobbly, frilly edge there. Doesn't have to be accurate. I'm just creating little dots and dabs. And your eye will kind of do a lot of the work for you as you piece together this picture. All right. That's looking pretty cool. I think there's some darker stuff over here. Remember, this is wet, so anything you put into there is going to be spreading out a little bit. You can take advantage of it all you want. All right, so let's leave that to dry for a little bit, and we'll move on to our white flower again. So see how I'm working around the painting? I don't have to finish up one spot. I have to let things dry, kind of sit out. And we'll go back to adding some water. Now we're going to start off with this beautiful transition over here. Now this is going to be a little bit different. What I'm going to do is put kind of a yellow dot right here all by itself. It's going to be kind of intense. And then I'm going to use my water brush to make it expand outward. So I have this nice thing where it's most intense and yellow. Right in that little pole. That's the thing that's kind of farther away from us. Now watch this. I'm going to start by going outward here, creating the places where I want it to go. And then I'm going to connect it using like a little stream, little line. And it's going to pull that yellow paint into those areas almost automatically. It's starting to spread. So you don't even have to blend that on your own. You can work this stuff while it's still live on your paper. See how we isolated that yellow area? It's really delicate. Maybe there's some white spaces. It's not just a solid fill. So you almost have to be like a coach. You're coaching the color. You can't control what every player does, but you're coaching it along the way. Let's try it again over here. But with this one, I think I'm going to actually do just this front part is going to be, oh, I got a little yellow on this water brush, which that's one issue. Let's do one coat of yellow, but we'll just stick it to this side because we'll add something else to that other side. That looks pretty good. All right. I know there's a little bit of a glare there. But we certainly have some color in that spot. All right. So while we're waiting for these things to dry, let's punch up some of our darks. Well, this is where it gets fun. So far we've basically just used green, yellow, and a little bit of that rusty red, that sienna. But for now, I'm going to go back to my smaller brush here. And I kind of think that in this green up at the top, I'm looking at this really cool area right here where it's really dark when it butts up against the light area. That's what we call a strong contrast. It's a really like sharp transition between light and dark. So what I'm going to do, for some reason, I think there needs to be some purple in here. Part of the reason for that, purple is the opposite of yellow. But when it's next to yellow, it really makes the yellow scream. Like it's really intense. So we're going to do a little experiment. Who knows how it'll turn out. But on this bulb here, I got this pretty strong purple. And this is going to be the shadow color. And that's going to help this thing really pop out. I'm going to make this a little bigger too. And since that was a little intense, that's why I love this water brush so much, is you can kind of use that if you kind of are in between. You want to just blend some of that purple out so it's not so intense, but it still gives you that soft transition. But see how much that punches up that area? We still have our greens kind of living in there. We might even be able to use that purple later to do some shading, but let's wait to do that. Again, I still have this purple on my brush. Let's look at some other places where it's really going to help us pop. Right where it meets the edge on this stem, we're creating some high contrast areas that make that edge of the flower pop out. Okay. Then I'm going to use this really, this is where your drawing comes in, trying to get like these things to look a little bit more separated. We certainly have the shadow underneath, but what this dark edge does, it really pops out that white flower petal right there. It doesn't show up as purple, right? Because it's kind of blending with the other colors. Same thing over here. We're going to try to show a little bit more of this shape, because in reality that flower is casting a shadow on its own stem. And we can show that maybe this one kind of goes in front of this. Still a little sketchier, but we're taking advantage of those details to help us shape the other places that are basically just blank paper. Doesn't have to be all purple. I'm going to actually throw some blue in here. Especially some of these areas. I notice there's a nice little dark area here. I haven't used black once here, right? So see how much more authority that shape has? I'm going to use some of that blue, maybe a little bit of the purple mixed in to just sharpen up some of the edges. Let's go back here. And there really is this shape here. I'm drawing with purple now. That's definitely giving me a really strong edge, making that other flower petal really pop out. Could even use that really sharp edge there. Maybe for the darkest darks, I just put a little dab to make that stand out against the yellow area in back. How about here? Definitely some shadow stuff going on. And maybe in one of those little folds as well. All right, let's use that purple again. Spice up this flower here. We really want to keep it delicate, but we want to show some separation. We're not even completing the shapes. If I put some purple behind this, it really helps that form of that area pop out. So we're using that opposite color to our advantage. See how much brighter that yellow looks by comparison? Maybe we even put a little bit of edge stuff here just to give it a little more volume. All right. Let's go back to this area. A couple more of those wobbly shapes. Then we can show the separation between those flower petals a little bit better. They cast a shadow on one another. Again, if you don't have a really detailed brush, it can be a little bit difficult to make some of these more delicate adjustments. But again, like I said, investing in your materials is going to actually pay off by making you feel like a better artist. So there is a major difference. So if you ever are hesitating and you're serious about just really enjoying what you do, which is making art, you're going to want to make the investment. All right, let's go down to this one, put some more shape in. So this is the point where my brush is starting to dry out a little bit, but it gives me some really more sketchy stuff. So if you like drawing in a sketchy style, it's a really fun stage to be at. You can give it a little bit of texture, so it's not always just that smooth and floaty stuff there. So these kind of ridges in that trumpet shape, where you just want to give the eye a little bit of eye candy to focus on. A really delicate line, a little sharp point. But notice I'm not outlining any of these shapes. I'm just kind of really floating them in there. not getting too obsessed with everything else. All right. So let's start creating some more contrast, because I think we're kind of going on quite a bit of time here. Yeah, we're at an hour 15, maybe about an hour. So let's kind of wrap this one up with some more contrast. So we're going to go back into these stems and really make those flowers pop a little bit more before we get too crazy with anything else. So I'm actually going to take a larger brush. This one is a flat, but what's cool is I don't have to make a wide line. I can make a really skinny line too. And let's darken them up. I was really liking that blue on those green green stems. So let's take a look at where we can do that. Okay, so I'm using the corner of the brush here. I'm going to do the whole back side of this thing. I'm just making a statement. That really turns that thing in space a little bit more. Same thing here. You can get a really sharp point on there now. Accentuate that curly Q shape, which we all love. This one is kind of a unique shape because it flips around completely. But maybe this side is a little bit lighter. All right, now let's go into these areas and disguise some of that harsh purple. The blue, instead of mixing it on the palette, we're now mixing it on top with a glaze. So now that that's somewhat dry, we're mixing colors on the canvas or on the paper. Doing kind of a glaze over the top can really just make some major changes with one swoop of the brush instead of feeling like you made a mistake. The other thing about making good watercolors is you want to give, when I talked about eye candy, there's a couple favorite things I like to do. Try to hide colors that you wouldn't expect in an area of your painting. You know, so like with that purple, that's like a little treat that's hidden inside of our painting. And if somebody looks really closely, they can get that little reward. But remember, I didn't use any black, which is kind of hard to believe, right? Use those high contrast edges to really pop out lighter areas. Because we have this whole one right here that we haven't really exploited yet. I'm going in first with the blue, but that's going to help me out with this stem. I can even just float that blue in there because we used it, remember, on the shading. Okay, I also didn't take care of like these little shedded areas where there's some little red, kind of like peeling stalk areas there. Let's make another flower petal here, just a little change so it doesn't feel unfinished. This is really starting to pop. Okay, so let's go back in. Got a little bit of blue on this side. I'm going to put a little blue in here. Let's see how that looks. That shadow pops a little bit more. Maybe not the best decision, but hey. Other thing is you don't want to draw things too obviously. It's kind of a not a straightforward way to think about it all the time. But if you just outline things like a cartoon, you're very rarely going to get the result you want. Your eye really likes to chew on like shapes. So like for this thing, I didn't really do too much with it. Remember we used that rusty red? Well, see how this kind of has some texture to it? Why don't we try some dry brush? So what I'm going to do is I have some paint on my brush, but I'm going to color on like a paper towel until there's no drips on there. And then I'm going to use the texture of the paper. And this one didn't work too well. It works really good with like dark colors. But we can tell that that's a little bit different section. We have a little bit of it over here as well. Sometimes it works when you just kind of get the dry part of the cake there. Gives it a little bit more texture so it's not a solid outline. Let's put this little peeled area. This must have been where the bud turned into. Yeah, it was almost like peeled off to expose the flower. Again, we're just kind of picture yourself in a dream state. This isn't reality. We want this to be more of a impression, something that is just like partially described. All right. Now I am going to try to do some more accenting. So this would be like the salt and pepper stage. We're not going to use black in my opinion, but I am going to use some pretty intense colors. So I really like those stems, that blue and purple. Okay, I won't use black, but I will use, so the opposite, I'm going to put a little bit of orange and yellow, maybe just yellow. Let's just put a little bit of that yellow in here. It's almost going to make a black because the opposite colors cancel each other out when you mix them. That's nice and dark, so we'll really punch up some of these areas where we want it to really show that edge. We can draw our lines with that. This will really sharpen it up. And you don't have to go in and do every single detail, right? We're just giving the eye something to really munch on. A really sharp edge here and there. And as you paint, you kind of get to know some of these tricks. I'm not really even looking at the photo anymore. I've kind of switched over. From our first reality is the photo or whatever we're looking at. And then at a certain point, you just got to switch over. You got to say, okay, enough's enough. I have enough information to complete this painting on my own. You know, we've made some changes You can see those as mistakes, like they're not accurate, but what you should be doing is thinking about them as opportunities to create your own reality. I'm looking for those sharp little accents that can help my drawing really stand out, just to give my viewer a hint at what to see. Don't spell it out for them. Let them do some work too. Not all of it has to be sharp like I'm doing here, but for some of those things, like just to give a sense of those wiggling edges there, or that now there's like a little use some lines to make it seem like it's popping out of that shape. One more layer to a shadow here and there. We can show some overlap. This flower petal slightly overlaps that one. Maybe this flower petal isn't so perfect. It's got a little wobble to it, and it casts a shadow on the other one. But do you see how this dark little spot makes it look like this white is really popping? I think we need a little bit of a something right here just to show that there's another petal that goes right out there. It's got some details in it we didn't really notice before. Let's go over to this one, sharpen it up a little bit. Right next to that yellow, punch in that purple that we're using. This thing is going to really make that rock separate out from the background. Got this little dark purple shape where that peeled off, it looks like. And maybe we're accenting the bottom. Instead of just shading it in, we're drawing lines, almost like cross-hatching, if you watch that demo. I want to show that texture of that cool shape. Sometimes you can overdo it pretty easily, but here I feel like we have a pretty solid setup now. We're just using some of those dark shadows to help us. Maybe there's a couple texture lines in that kind of trumpet area. Really draw it out. But we are going a little bit over time today. I hope that's all right. Spent a little bit of extra time sharpening this up. But overall, I think we made a pretty beautiful composition here. And thanks, Joe and Kate, everyone who tuned in today. It looks like we got a pretty big crowd. And I kind of got in the zone here, so I just want you guys to know that I haven't forgot about you. But the last thing I'll say about this is, one thing you want to keep in mind is that while you're working, keep an eye on your hands. As you get more comfortable, thinking about how wet certain areas are, kind of move around your painting and be careful that your hand is not smudging this. Like with this nice white background here, we certainly wouldn't want to smear our paint, and that is an issue if you aren't careful. But the one thing I will say about this is if you did this all with your pencil sketches, I don't know if you guys can see it too well, but there are a little bit of things with pencils. One thing to do, no matter what eraser you're using, always get in the habit of cleaning off your eraser. If you're wearing jeans, the best way to do that is to kind of erase on your jeans for a little bit to make sure there's nothing else on there that's going to get onto your paper and smudge something. You can lightly erase over these colors, but you want to just be very gentle if you have any extra pencil markings there. And if you have rough paper, it's especially hard to kind of get all the way in. So that's why using either a light pencil or something like a kneaded eraser, which is a little bit different, that can help you get those things out so you don't have to deal with it. Sometimes you might like how the pencil line looks, but the other thing we didn't really mention is if you use watercolor pencils, that's another way that you could have the pencil drawing almost dissolve into the painting that you make. So I don't want to smear this. That's the other thing. As I've tried this and I try to like wipe the eraser dust away then smear the painting I've been working on. But that just about does it. I'll be posting this, or maybe make a few things that I'll sign it, and I'll be posting it on Instagram. If you guys tried out something like this, or in the future you end up trying out this lesson or picking your own flowers or just want to post that inspiration, I would love if you guys would tag me on Instagram, and that is art_with_Anderson, or as always, comment, like, and subscribe here. I always enjoy hearing your response, your ideas, and otherwise I'll be seeing you guys on Saturday, and I want you guys to stay tuned. I have a few special announcements I'll be making over this next week. There's going to be a giveaway raffle that I'm going to be doing soon, and more details to follow, and I'll have that ready for Saturday. But I hope you guys have enjoyed this. This has been Art with Anderson, and I hope you guys are enjoying this series as much as I am, because this gives me something creative to focus on every single time I do it. So thanks again. I will see you soon, and this has been Art with Anderson. I'll see you guys next time, and hope you have a great day. Thank you. Oh.